Matcha lattes are becoming very popular these days, and there are many different ways to make them. A lot of people find matcha green tea lattes to be a great way to incorporate matcha tea into their daily routine. In this video, we're going to walk you through the steps you can follow to make an excellent matcha latte at home. We'll start by talking about what you need to make an iced matcha latte and a matcha tea latte. Next, we'll talk to you about 2 different matcha latte recipes you can try. Before we get started, please make sure that you're subscribed to our YouTube channel so you can stay tuned for future tea videos. We have hundreds of videos about all different topics in the world of Japanese green tea, but for this episode, we're going to focus specifically on matcha lattes. Without further ado, let's get started. First, what do you need to make a matcha green tea latte? There are a few things you need when it comes to making a matcha tea latte. There are a couple of substitutions you can make, but it's best to follow the list as closely as possible. First, you need 1 teaspoon of latte matcha. We recommend this one from Mr. Masuda in Shizuoka. Then you will need 2 teaspoons of sugar or another sweetener. This is optional if you don't need your matcha latte to be that sweet. Also, you'll need 3 tablespoons of hot water and 300 milliliters of warm oat milk, soy milk, or coconut milk. When it comes to making an iced matcha latte, you'll need the same list of ingredients with the addition of 5 matcha ice cubes. These are easy to make, as we'll demonstrate in a few moments. First, let's talk about why you should use latte matcha for your matcha green tea latte. There are 2 main categories for matcha powder: high quality matcha, which is meant to be consumed plain, and latte matcha, which is meant to be mixed into a matcha green tea latte. There are 2 reasons why you should use latte matcha for your matcha tea latte. The first reason is that the matcha is much more affordable, and with the quantity you use for making matcha tea lattes, you will save lots of money. The second reason is that you actually don't want a high quality matcha in your green tea latte necessarily. High quality matcha is carefully produced so that it has a natural sweetness to it and a smooth finish. While this makes it great for drinking plain, the flavor is often overshadowed by the plant milk, so you will end up with a less flavorful matcha green tea latte. The latte matcha tends to have a stronger taste profile, so you can really notice it through the milk. Why should you use matcha ice cubes in your iced green tea latte? We often like to recommend matcha ice cubes when making an iced green tea latte. While ice cubes are great for keeping your drinks cold, they really dilute the flavor when they melt, and this can make the drinking experience less enjoyable. If you really want to maximize the flavor of your iced green tea latte, you can make up some matcha tea and freeze it in an ice cube tray overnight. You can then use a few of these cubes in your iced matcha latte to keep it cold. As these cubes melt, instead of watering down your iced matcha latte, they will make it even more flavorful. If there's one takeaway from this whole matcha green tea latte guide, it should be to limit the amount of water you use in your latte. When it comes to matcha tea lattes, the biggest mistake people make is adding too much water. The matcha powder is what gives it the flavor. The sugar and milk give the matcha tea latte a smooth and sweet flavor, but the water just adds volume and dilutes the flavor. One way to reduce the water content is by using matcha ice cubes instead of regular ice cubes, as we mentioned earlier. Another way is to start out with making a matcha paste rather than a full bowl of matcha and later adding the plant milk. All of these steps will help you make the best matcha tea latte, and we will go through them in more detail next. Step 1. Sifting the powder. The first step when it comes to any matcha latte recipe is sifting the powder. You may not find this step listed elsewhere, but it is important nonetheless. Because matcha is ground into such a fine powder, it's very sensitive to the humidity in the air. This causes it to form clumps once the package is open. The matcha is still fine to use when it has these clumps. It will just be more difficult to mix it into the matcha tea latte. We recommend to just run the powder through a sifter to remove these clumps. Once you have 2 grams of finely sifted powder at the bottom of a glass or matcha bowl, you are ready to continue to the next step. Step 2. Making the matcha paste. This second step is another one you may also not see recommended in other matcha latte recipes, but we think it really makes a big difference for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it adds an extra opportunity to get the clumps out of the matcha. When you're working with a small quantity of water, it's easier to find these clumps and mix them into a smooth matcha paste. Even when making regular matcha tea, we recommend this step, as it can really improve the taste. In special Japanese tea ceremonies, the guests actually drink this matcha paste, or koicha. When drinking the matcha tea like this, all the flavors and health benefits are amplified, but if you're using a lower quality matcha, it can become incredibly bitter. That is why it's really important to go for a high quality okumidori matcha. The second benefit to creating the matcha paste is that it allows you to use less water. At this stage, you're just adding 3 tablespoons of warm water to the matcha powder and mixing it up. In other matcha latte recipes, you may find recommendations for much larger amounts of water, but we find that this actually dilutes the matcha tea latte. With this added matcha paste step, you have more room for adding a delicious oat milk and extra matcha flavor. Once you have the matcha paste, you are ready to continue to the next step. Step 3. Adding the warm milk. The next step is pretty clear, but there is a very important bonus step that you should follow, and that is to make sure that the milk is warm. Because we're using so little water, the temperature of the matcha tea latte will be determined by the temperature of the milk. That's why it's important to make your milk warm or even hot before adding it to the matcha paste. The best way to do this is in a pan or on the stove. But you can also use a microwave if you don't have access to a stove. Just pour in 300 milliliters of milk into the pan and turn on the heat until small bubbles begin to form or it begins to steam. If you don't like it to be too hot, you can of course stop the heat once it hits the desired temperature. You may find it helpful to check in on the temperature periodically so you can stop it exactly where you want it. You can then pour this warm milk into the bowl or cup that you're using and stir it in with the paste. Which type of plant milk should you use in your matcha green tea latte? There are many different types of plant milks that work well, and it all depends on your taste. It seems like oat milk has been a clear winner in recent years, so we'd recommend starting there. They now have oat milks like the Oatly Barista Blend that are meant to be mixed into lattes. Soy milk also works quite well, and the sweeter flavor is a nice complement to the matcha tea. Step 4 is adding the sweetener. Once you have the matcha tea and the oat milk mixed together, it's time to add the sweetener. As we mentioned before, it's probably not such a good habit to rely too much on the sweetener. So see if you can add a little bit less each time you make the matcha tea latte. That being said, you can start with 2 teaspoons of sugar and see how you like the taste. The plant milks tend to have their own sweetness to them, so even if you don't add sugar, the matcha green tea latte still should be nice and sweet. Some people talked about liking maple syrup, honey, or agave in their matcha latte, and you may even be surprised with brown sugar. Either way, it comes down to what taste you prefer the most. Just make sure to try and experience the flavor of the matcha tea latte with less sweetener every once in a while. The final step is to mix the matcha tea latte. The best tool for this is the matcha whisk or chasen, but you can also use a milk frother if you have one. If you're using the bamboo whisk, make sure to rinse it well afterwards so you don't put it away dirty. After your matcha latte has been mixed up, it's ready to serve. Some people like to decorate the top of the matcha latte with a tiny bit of matcha powder, but don't feel the need to be fancy if you're just planning on drinking it right away. Next, we get to the best iced matcha latte recipes. While the iced matcha latte recipes are more or less the same, there are a few key differences that we will highlight for each step. Step 1, sifting the matcha powder. Just as with the warm matcha latte, you should also sift the matcha powder when making the iced green tea latte. This is especially important with the iced matcha latte because it's harder to mix the matcha powder with cold water than it is with hot water. If the matcha doesn't mix in evenly, it will create an unpleasant taste, so it's especially important to sift a teaspoon of matcha powder into the glass before preparing this iced green tea latte. Step 2 is making the matcha paste. As we mentioned before, it's especially difficult to mix the matcha powder into an iced green tea latte, so you'll need all the help that you can get. We will actually still be using 3 tablespoons of warm water for the iced matcha latte. The reason for this is that the warm water will help the matcha powder mix into a paste, and it will have little effect over the overall temperature of the drink. If you're worried about making this drink too hot, you can also wait for a few minutes as the matcha paste cools down before you add the milk in the next step. Step 3, adding in the cold milk. The temperature of the matcha tea latte will mostly come down to the temperature of the oat milk, so it's important to use cold milk. If you keep your oat milk in the fridge slightly chilled, this should be perfect. Because new cartons of oat milk and soy milk are not usually refrigerated, you may want to stick it in the fridge right before making your iced matcha latte. Remember that for the iced matcha latte recipes, we are using 200 milliliters of oat milk rather than 300 milliliters. Step 4, adding the sweetener. The sweetener step is slightly different when making the cold matcha latte because it will be harder to dissolve. You should stir the sweetener into the iced matcha latte just as you would with the warm one, but this time just expect it to take a little bit more stirring before it mixes evenly. Once it's all mixed in and sweetened to your liking, you are ready to move on to the next step. Step 5, adding the matcha ice cubes. This next step is probably the one most people are curious about. These matcha ice cubes may seem difficult to make, but they are actually quite easy. All you have to do is prepare a bowl of matcha tea and pour it into an ice cube tray. Then you can just put the ice cube tray into the freezer and let it sit overnight. In the morning, you should have a dozen or so matcha ice cubes ready to be used in an iced matcha latte. In a regular glass of iced green tea latte, you should only need about 4 to 5 ice cubes, so you should only need to prepare a new tray of ice cubes a couple of times a week. The reason we use the matcha ice cubes is that in addition to keeping the drink cold, they also concentrate the flavor of the matcha tea latte. The problem with regular ice cubes is that if you don't drink the iced matcha latte right away, they will melt and dilute your drink over time. These matcha ice cubes just add more flavor when they melt. The final step is mixing up your iced matcha latte. If you find that the stirring is difficult with the ice cubes, you can just move the stirring to step 5 and add in the ice cubes after. You will find it harder to stir with larger ice cubes compared to smaller ones, so you may want to invest in a different ice cube tray if you find that the larger ice cubes are a hassle. Finally, what's the best latte matcha for matcha green tea lattes? When it comes to the best matcha powder you can use in your matcha tea lattes, the best is this latte matcha. This is a matcha we found after meeting with the farmer Mr. Masuda in Shizuoka. Mr. Masuda has a lot of premium matcha teas he produces without pesticides, but this one is specifically designed for lattes. When it comes to latte matcha, you should always go for pesticide-free and find one that is made in Japan. This way you can still save some money without compromising on taste and quality. I hope you have all found this video helpful. If you'd like to learn more about matcha, please feel free to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for future tea videos. If you have any questions about matcha or green tea in general, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Until then, we'll see you next time.